Hello, and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's episode, I'm talking to the incredible Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan. Suhaiymah is a writer, poet, and educator disrupting understandings of history, race, knowledge, and violence. In 2019, Suhaiymah's debut poetry collection, Postcolonial Banter, was published, featuring 8 years' worth of poetry, including her viral poem, This Is Not a Humanising Poem, which placed her as runner-up of the National Roundhouse Poetry Slam in 2017 and has over 2 million views online. Her latest book, Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia, was published with Pluto Press in 2022. The non-fiction work has been widely endorsed and is described as our book by former Guantanamo Bay prisoner Moazzam Begg, courageous by rapper Lowkey, one of the most exciting voices of her generation by award-winning Channel 4 journalist Fatima Manji, and fierce by feminist activist Lola Olufemi. Suhaiymah has also written for The Guardian, Independent, Al Jazeera, and Galdem, and has essays in multiple anti-racist anthologies, including I Refuse to Condemn and Cut from the Same Cloth. Currently, Suhaiymah is writer-in-residence at the Leeds Playhouse and a visiting research fellow in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University of London. So, Assalamu alaikum, Suhaiymah. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Wa alaikum salam. Really happy to be here.
How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, not too bad. Yeah, glad the sun's out. How are you?
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm good, alhamdulillah. So I'm just going to jump straight in. Have you always had a passion for seeking out the truth and fighting for social justice?
I guess that's a hard question, isn't it? Because is it a passion? Like, do any of us have a passion for speaking up the truth, or is it like, I think the right conditions where we're able to do it, and I think alhamdulillah, I think I was sort of often have felt safe enough in environments that I've been in that I feel like I can speak up about things. And B, perhaps just like a bit of a naivety, I think, where, feeling that, gosh, do people not realize what's going on? But, like, I should better tell them what's happening. I think perhaps I have, like, even since childhood been just curious, I would say, rather than necessarily passionate, but curious about why when I walk home from school do some kids walk a different way, and how come that happens to be that it's the black and brown kids who go one way, just these sort of questions. And I think that very easily becomes speaking about kind of revealing injustices, just in a very organic way. So I wouldn't necessarily claim to have been passionate about speaking about the truth for my entire life or anything like that. But I think, then as you develop language to understand what those things are that are happening, and I think, like I say, having the conditions and perhaps the ability to, in terms of, I'm self-employed, I'm a freelancer, right? As a creative, I think having those mediums as well to be able to express things, I guess to some degree, it also becomes a bit of a responsibility. And I think Islamically, that definitely feels true. So yeah, I wouldn't that so much, but I would definitely say that the conditions have been there, and it's felt like something that's become increasingly important and possible. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. So I just want to unpack this thing about language. And I think so this came through a lot, I think, in your recent book and a lot of your essays as well, is like just the importance of being able to articulate what it is that we're going through, our experiences, to have the terminology to be able to say, okay, this is Islamophobia and this is what it means.
Yeah.
And I think it's changed a lot recently. Like my parents and I think yours as well, like when they came over from Pakistan or from Kashmir, they didn't have the language to describe that what they were going through was racism or was prejudice. And then when that kind of comes out, it's almost like an awakening takes place. And you write about it, and I think it's really important in this day and age. And I just wanted to get your reflections on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with what you've said, and I would add as well, not just language, but also I think the communal trauma. I think that we're sort of maybe of a generation where also, we don't just have to be focused on survival in the same way. And I think our parents and our grandparents knew that they were experiencing racism. That's, there's no doubt about that. But as you say, not necessarily having the vocabulary, but even those who did, because we can't forget that, in the 70s and the 80s, there was a lot of movement, but perhaps of a younger generation, and perhaps also that racism in the way that we experience it has changed also. So that makes it intriguing, right? And not just to, do the whole after 9/11, everything changed. But I think that who Muslim as an identity that people were kind of coded as did become a different thing. And you could say that was since the 1988 Salman Rushdie affair. You could kind of trace that to different moments in the 90s. But in either case, I think that, where we might have been called Pakis or whatever else, a couple of decades ago, that's also different. And so I think there was also a transition where perhaps we needed to find a language that didn't even exist. And for me, the reason that is so important to me, this kind of thing about language, is that just in my own experience, that's been true. And I think for anybody who's been politicized, and you can read it in people's autobiographies and stuff, it'll always be that I started having this feeling, and then I started reading books. And this idea that language and learning, I think, are the first step to kind of movement building and organizing. And that was also part of my impetus behind the book, was that, okay, perhaps I don't have, maybe I'm not the person who has the skills to kind of do XYZ thing, but something that I may be able to contribute is raising consciousness through kind of just giving people the language. And, the thing that people often say, and this is even with my poetry, is that, no one ever says, oh, this is so novel, this is complete, what people tend to say is, oh, you've articulated something that we always knew to be true, or that we've always felt. Yeah. And that's, and I think that's so telling, because what it says is that, sometimes all we require to feel galvanized or able to mobilize is, I think, the validation that language gives to our experience, but then also the way that it allows us to articulate it in a way that can kind of name. And this is the thing, I think that a lot of times, racism, whiteness, coloniality, all the power structures that shape the world we're in, they are made to appear natural. We don't name them because it's just that's just the way things are. And as soon as you name something, I think it allows you then to acknowledge that, okay, it must have a history to it, it must be constructed, it must have come from somewhere. And if it's come from somewhere, the bit I find exciting is that, well, it must also be able to be ended. There must, if someone made it, or if people made it, or if society made it, then perhaps we can unmake it. And I think that is where you become empowered, for lack of a better word, because it suddenly almost makes things manageable, right? Because it's like, and that's just a language, and that's why I do think language is powerful. And maybe I'm biased as someone who does love writing, but I think that all of that is something that happens almost psychologically, and then it allows us to do the material changing with our hands. But yeah, I think there's so much that I have personally experienced language do for me, and yeah, it seems silly to overlook that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. And I think for me, like personally, having a way to fully articulate, the everyday microaggressions that we've been dealing with ever since, kind of we went to school or we went outside. And obviously they have changed and they build up. I remember at one point feeling like, why in certain spaces do I feel so tired? Like I feel exhausted, and like when I left certain rooms or certain conversations, I would need to like lie down because I just felt so drained. And it is because of these tiny microaggressions that are racist, that are Islamophobic. And I think, like you rightly said, when you're able to understand that that's what's going on, you have a context, you have a full picture, and then you can understand that, okay, well, you're right, it started from somewhere, it has an ending. How we're going to get there and when we'll get there and what that's going to look like is a different issue.
But it's also one that's up to us. And I think because I think there's something about, I also think there's something, what you've said about that feeling, just that very visceral thing of exhaustion, and it's just these small things that build up. And I think in a way it almost flips the framework when you have that language, because it's also like, oh, the onus isn't on me to hold all of this. Actually, the onus is on everything else to answer as to why these conditions exist. So I think there's also something in that. But yeah, I completely hear you.
Yeah. So you wrote an essay in the essay collection, I Refuse to Condemn.
Yeah.
And in that essay, you talk about this difference between liberation and equality. I think it was that essay. And I really loved that. And I felt like, again, that to me, like, oh, that's exactly like how I feel, that equality, when we ask for equality, we're thinking about something potentially quite visual, like we want more Muslims or more people of color in certain spaces, but equality itself doesn't mean liberation. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I guess, my thinking around that is just to put it in simple terms, who do we want to be equal to? And I think oftentimes that we kind of, when we want equality, we accept the premise of the world as it is. So we say, we want to be politicians too. Well, we want to have money too. And I think what that does very sneakily is that it forces us to accept the status quo, basically, because it just says we just want to slot into what already exists, and have power on the terms that power already exists. And so I think for me, the difference, if we're going to talk about something like liberation, which even, maybe is still an ambiguous term to some degree, but I think what I'm really trying to say is that that can't be our focus, because we can't accept the status quo. That isn't ever, and fundamentally, because that isn't ever going to, that mean if we kind of want to just be slotted into it, then our quote unquote equality or our experience of, benefits will come at the cost of so many people, and they might even be people who are our own family members, our own communities, or at least, across the global south. And I think, it's not by accident that that's become the kind of narrative, EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, that it's not, I don't think it's by accident that that has become the primary framework through which anti-racism is today kind of talked about. And actually I've just finished reading a really fantastic book by Asfar Shafi and Ilyas Nugdi, and it's about kind of how anti-racism in the last 40, 50 years is deliberately co-opted by the state in the language of it, so that even things we've just talked about in this conversation, that microaggressions become the primary thing that we talk about, and it's more important that, employers say your name correctly rather than actually who they're paying, how they're employing, who's who's benefiting or not benefiting from the working conditions and those kinds of things. And so I do think that equality it's too easy to it's too easy, and I think that should be a red flag in of itself. And so liberation, or whatever other words we might want to use, I think that demands a bit, we have to be less lazy with our thinking. We have to kind of go, oh, okay, like actually for everybody to experience, justice or safety, what might have to change. And I think it becomes much more fundamental things have to change, much deeper things. And, throughout my book Tangled in Terror, but I think a lot of my work I am also really interested in, and I don't have the answers, but I'm interested in, what are the root causes? Because often these conversations as well, I think distract us from the root causes of injustice, because, it's sort of just a plaster, isn't it, on top? It's and we've seen this in the last 2 years since Black Lives Matter uprisings, this kind of feeling that racism is here, it's bad. So how can we kind of cover it up? Like, how can we, who can we get in the room? And it's just like the room is the problem. It's not about who's in it. And I think, this is why I think poetry also helps, because metaphors, I think, do help us to think in a bit more like question, kind of problematize and play with a lot of the things that we just have to take for granted. I think I took your question in a really tangential way. I can't remember what you actually said. Yeah, equality and liberation.
No, that was actually really good. And as you were talking, I was thinking as well that equality, it is too easy, because it doesn't demand a fundamental change. It doesn't demand a change in actual beliefs and attitudes and what form the basis of the entire the whole of society. It's like you said, like putting a bad plaster on a
exactly. No, sorry, I was just gonna say, I remember the first kind of time that question reared its head for me was just, kind of thinking about mainstream feminism and thinking about, well, if I was to be equal to a man who experiences the same racial, racist, Islamophobic, whatever experiences as me, that's not really much liberate. That's very like great. Like, now I'm just going to be, policed in a different way. And so I think that was when I started being like, hang on, there's not just like, it's not just a scale that's imbalanced and we all want to be on the other side, because it's just not how it works.
Absolutely. And I have like such issue with like recruitment in workplaces that kind of have these where we want to be more inclusive, we want to be more diverse in our hiring, but actually, does your workplace, does the ethics of it, does the actions of it make impact our communities? Is it actually somewhere we're going to feel comfortable working and we want to work? It feels very, very surface level.
It's very PR, isn't it? I think everything's become a PR exercise, and I think we've reached this weird moment where like actually the kind of the moral argument has almost been won by anti-racism, in the sense that people are like, oh, you know what, racism, yeah, it's bad, I don't want to seem racist. But more than that, I think within a framework of capitalism, institutions and organizations know that it can actually now be detrimental to your profits if you appear to be racist. And so not only has the moral argument kind of gone there, I think, and in fact I don't think the moral argument has gone there, I think it's more that the profit making argument has gone there. And so this is why it's like, it's not just surface level, but it's also perhaps more insidious than that, in that it's just like we care about these things because they will ensure that we still have consumers and that we still have demand. And it's just so clever. It's, racism can just be repackaged, and I think capitalism is very good at rebranding itself basically as well. And so I think what we've seen in the last few years is a lot of rebrands, but yeah, as you say, have the conditions changed? And if they haven't, and if that gap remains, then I think that's where we have to remain really critical and really like curious about, well, what's actually going on here?
Yeah, and on that capitalism point, actually, you in Tangled in Terror, when you write about the Muslim threat, this war on terror, and this issue of security, how actually, if we look at it carefully, there's many people or bodies or institutes that benefit from it in the realm of capitalism.
Yeah, and I think this is something that goes missed a lot, right, in the conversations that we have, because it becomes a lot about baddies and goodies, and people are Islamophobic because they're ignorant, or they're Islamophobic because they're cruel, or any other reason. And I think actually that makes it really difficult. I think that kind of leads us to doing trying to combat Islamophobia through these like intellectual arguments, moral arguments, those things. And perhaps those things have a place. I'm not saying there's no place. However, when you kind of realize that, there are security technologies, there are, arms businesses, arms trades. If you're a manufacturer of drones, you sell more drones and you make more money the longer and the more people that believe that Muslims are a threat, whether that's at the border, whether that's internationally, whether that's nationally. And I think that actual kind of just financial transaction, demand and supply element is really important to center, because once you do that, you go, it doesn't really matter then if, us saying that Islamophobia is mean, it hurts, blah, 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 doesn't really target the reason that it exists. And it was actually in the process of writing that became more and more clear to me, because I think I myself had not really acknowledged the depth of that, and that there's global money making on the back of this, and that this is also why our governments are invested in it, because they're selling, the prevent strategy is being sold overseas. And one of the reasons that you can't access the report that is behind prevent is that the government actually say that, for commercial reasons, that in case can't remember the exact wording, but it's like in case another product is put on the market that it would compete with this. And so when you realize that there's this profit making element behind it, I think it just helps us to kind of reassess like where we're actually focusing, because actually will a load of adverts saying that Muslims are good too, or videos about us being helpful and contributing lots to charity, will that end Islamophobia? No. And I think that's hard to accept, but it is useful, and I hope it can just open up a new set of conversations about, right then, but what is our target? What is our goal? Where do we resist? And in a way, it kind of simplifies the problem, because it's not so ambiguous, it's not so confusing. It's just that, this is a really beneficial thing. And I think the other thing, just to add to that point, final point, is just that the other thing to say is that is just what racism always has been. Racism came into existence because it was profitable, and that's why empire and racism are, you can't separate those things. And so in a way, I also think that we're not dealing with a new problem. This is a really old problem. It's just got a new face in a way.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with that, especially on how we cannot separate racism and the empire, because that whole point was, we're going over there to civilize. Like, we need to, these people are barbaric and they're backwards, and we need to take our values and our ideas and spread it, even though the ideas here weren't always that great anyway. So
Yeah, well, exactly. And really, that again, it's just that thing of this is the rhetoric, but what's happening on the ground? You're stealing, you're looting, you're, dehumanizing, brutalizing, policing. And it is
exactly.
fascinating that to this day, really, that element is still not
Mm,
focused on. It's just the rhetoric, and that
yeah.
shows, I think, I guess the PR power of racism.
Because in the book you mentioned, I can't remember who it is, but someone that had gone over the Middle East and was
Mm.
looking at Christians in the
Yeah,
Middle
Lord
East and talking,
Cromer.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and
yeah,
was
yeah.
talking about how they're not progressive enough or
Yeah, so he
whatever
sort
it
of
is.
says that Christianity in the East has stagnated because it's been
Yeah,
surrounded by Orientals,
yeah,
which is a fascinating thing to
exactly. and
say.
then there was a bit where as well in the book you mentioned where he meets or he sees women that are covered, but then actually when he comes back here and there's legislation about women, he votes against all of it, doesn't
Yeah,
let
I think
any of it pass.
he starts the kind of campaign against suffrage for women. He's like the founder of that. So yeah, it's just that disingenuous thing that we see to this day that, oh God, when we need to go colonize those places to save Muslim women, as if he cares about women's rights, and then at home he's like, oh, but women shouldn't vote. That would be terrible.
Mm.
So I guess people have always been able to hold these contradictions.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to talk about this idea of the Muslim threat. Now, one of the things I really struggle to get my head around is how there has developed over time or whatever, like such a huge threat that people are willing to let Muslims go through so much. So, there's the legislation that's like detention without trial and all of these things that break so many human rights laws, but also just generally just that are wrong. And it really shocks me that
Yeah.
people, everyday people walking on the street and politicians and whatever, everybody seem to be totally fine with these.
Yeah.
And it feels like if that was any other situation, of course they'd say no. But
Yeah.
when it comes to Muslims, people are ready to justify it.
I think it's just been a fantastic propaganda effort, basically. I think
Mm,
states have done, because if you think about, we're 20 years deep into the very deliberate kind of construction of Muslims as a threat. And so if you are, let's say, if you've either been an adult in that entire time and kind of been indoctrinated, or you've grown up in that time and sort of only had that indoctrination, then I think it's just really powerful. It's been a really powerful kind of lobbying effort almost
mm,
to justify these things. But also I think fear is a really strong motivator. And so, whenever every few years we'll have this thing of the security threat is really high, the risk is massive. I think that makes people kind of accept conditions that they wouldn't. But more than that, when you dehumanize and you have historically dehumanized the perpetrator to the extent that really no one, it's like it's almost more bizarre for you to kind of suggest that, okay, yeah, somebody might have done something not good, but does that mean that, this legislation is justified? I think people actually aren't, I think that's a too of a nuanced argument almost. And
mm.
really, I think that the overwhelming kind of reason is just that there's been a really, because I think what you see is, and I think Aaron Kundnani makes this argument really well, is that whether it's the kind of far right narrative of all Muslims are terrorists, or it's the more liberal argument that no, it's not all Muslims, it's just a small handful.
Mm,
And I would say even Muslims themselves I've heard people saying this. It's just a small handful who have a twisted kind of interpretation of Islam. But in either case, and the kind of what really overwhelmingly binds all of this together is that you accept that, well, all Muslims require surveilling because any of them could be of the violent type. And so we do need to bring that kind of legislation. We do, and you kind of then get the argument of, well, if you're not one of them, you have nothing to worry about. And I think
mm,
that's something I really want to focus on the book as well, because actually that's not how surveillance works, and that's not how the impact of surveillance is. And there's another fantastic book that's just come out of Pluto Press, Rizwan Sabir's book called The Suspect, and it's about his own experience with surveillance and kind of being detained without trial and that kind of thing. And he um, you see really the psychological impacts on people of this self-surveillance that Muslims have then had to live with. And I think that's something that's really not understood because of this really simplistic idea that, if you're a good person, nothing will happen to you. If you're a bad person, then you'll be stopped. Because the
mm,
reality is that all Muslims now live with this heightened sense of scrutiny. Any of us can be stopped at the roadside, at the border, at the plane. our identities in the public imagination in general have become so hyper-criminalized that we're not safe to speak at school, we're not safe as students, we're not safe trying to access mental health services, going to hospital. And so actually you created, through 20 years of propaganda and the accompanying legislation, a situation in which, as you say, it's like horrifying for just even the ordinary kind of privileged Muslim in the British state, let alone those still in Guantanamo Bay, those facing occupation abroad. And so it is, I know what you mean, it is kind of, it's overwhelming, I think, when you actually face the facts. And I think it's really, to me, that's kind of where it is like, this is what racism is and has been. It's just the dehumanization of people that we willingly internalize. And I hope there are people who will read the book and go, because my worry was that people will read the book and go, God, that is really bad, but not actually confront the fact that no, but you yourself have internalized this. And we've all internalized this. And I think that's the scariest part, that, it's this deep thing. And this is why I also wanted to talk about secularism in the book, because I think that people don't really recognize how secularism has been part of colonialism, in the sense that, the way that Muslims are racialized as backwards isn't just because we're black and brown, it's because of religion. It's because we're deemed to have this backwards belief system. And secularism isn't this neutral thing. That was constructed as the opposite to those backwards religious others. And that was something I really wanted to put in the book, because I just thought there were going to be some, left-leaning, liberal, kind and good people who will be like, actually, Muslims don't deserve this dehumanization. But in the back of their mind, they're still going to find it awkward in the book when I'm saying things like, I hope that I've written this, but this book can be pleasing to Allah. It's like, I think that would still be uncomfortable to them. And if that's the case, I kind of ask the question of, well, how much have you still committed to that internal narrative that Muslims are a bit backwards still, like, and the thing is, if you are still committed to that at some level, then at some level you are still dehumanized, you're still othering us in a way that will allow and justify us being treated kind of differently and being brutalized. And I think it's just that the extent of dehumanization isn't even really accounted for fully, and that's I think that's why it's also so overwhelming.
It's really, really overwhelming. And I think the fact you just said how everyone's sort of internalized this, even we have. And I definitely feel like I have, and I see it as well in my everyday life, because I have a tendency to try and portray myself as like not a good Muslim in terms of like someone that's practicing or faith, but a good Muslim in terms of like, oh, but I wouldn't hurt anyone. I'm really kind, I'm really nice,
I'm funny,
exactly. And actually, even I've seen it play out in how we talk about faith. We end up saying things like, oh, well, Islam is peace. Exactly. Islam is way more than peace, right?
Islam doesn't mean peace. It's never meant peace.
And that's how because we try and make ourselves more palatable, or easy to understand and easy to relate to, but then it doesn't actually work, because what people that interact with us will say, well, you're not like that. It's just you're not like that, but there are still people that are like that. And it doesn't help the situation. But for us, it's actually it's exhausting. It's really, really difficult. And I don't think people understand the extent of the impact that has on us, and what it's going to have on future generations as well.
Well, because that's the thing. I think what you said, in a way, to be, I think the kinder interpretation as well on ourselves is that you're doing that to protect yourself. You're doing that to avoid hyper scrutiny. You're doing that to preempt criminalization. And I think, we can be hard on ourselves sometimes and kind of being like, God, I'm just performing the good Muslim. But there's a reason that's because it's not like you are like, I'm going to now do. It's so subconscious and it's so internalized that sometimes I'll just be like, oh God, why am I suddenly speaking in this tone of like, whoa, where's this come from? And it's just sort of taken over my limbs. But I think that really just speaks to actually the way that Islamophobia is so deep and so all-encompassing that we know without thinking consciously that we must preempt, or we must kind of deflect those gazes that are upon us. And as you say, that's exhausting, but also, what a life is that? That's not a life to live. And I think one thing that kind of motivated me to write the book was that, as you said about future generations, I think it breaks my heart when I do poetry workshops with kids in schools who they're 11 and 12 years old, and they already are so aware of how they're perceived. Their poems are already, I am not a terrorist, I am not oppressed. And you kind of think, God, you deserve to write about anything. You deserve to write poems about, their peers in their class are writing poems about, just much more, their imaginations haven't been shrunk to just
Mm.
all you get to be is an object that others look at and you just have to disprove it, disprove it, disprove it. And I think that really motivated me because it was like, no, we deserve more than that. And then also just to add to what you were saying there, I think as Muslims, we deserve to engage with Islam on its own terms. And I think something
Mm.
I feel really robbed of was that for the majority of my life so far, I think I always had to engage with Islam as something. It was this thing that I had to protect. It was this thing that I had to defend, but not a thing in of itself that I could turn to and look into and ask questions of. And the only questions that I asked of it initially were the questions to kind of from a PR angle, I would say, in terms of okay, well, what are the rights that women have in Islam, so that you can
Mm.
then respond to the question of women don't have rights,
Yeah.
rather than well, what are the questions I actually have about Islam? What is I think it's like it's a whole paradigm shift because suddenly if we didn't have that external gaze that was like so over scrutinizing us and asking us to prove that we deserve humanizing, I think we'd be able to have a really different experience of Islam. And I think that's something that is really difficult to comprehend and grasp. Even I think even as I'm aware of it's still every couple of weeks you'll kind of have another realization of like, oh God, like I never even thought about this thing in this way because I've only been thinking about how others perceive Islam. And so in a way we're only seeing Islam through the eyes of the West. And I
Mm.
think that's a real travesty. It doesn't do justice to us, it doesn't do justice to Islam, it doesn't do justice to anything. So even from that selfish point of view, it's like racism is just no good. It's just like
Mm.
not. We just deserve more than that. And I really do hope that because I know that the thing I didn't want the book to be overwhelming. Like I know we've talked about a lot of things that are overwhelming, but I also kind of wanted it to be hopeful in that sense of well, actually we can like we deserve to kind of approach Islam on our own terms. We deserve to ask these questions, and we deserve to exist outside of it. And so I do think there's also that element, like yes, there's the overwhelmingness, but in a way also Islam, I think helps us through that because it's also a thing of well this world isn't perfect, it was never meant to be perfect, but we're not this world is not the be all and end all for us. And I
Mm.
think there's also that motivates us a to make this world better, but b also to not, I suppose, not despair
Mm.
because this isn't the be all and end all. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's trying to navigate that balance of like god, things are terrible, but also that's okay, we can come together, we can change things, we have the power, we can we don't know the future. And if we really trust that God is all knowing and all powerful, then we can't give up. We can't
Mm.
despair. And so I think it's staying in that balance, isn't it? Of like,
Yeah.
be shocked by the tyrannies that we see. Otherwise, you're not going to be moved to change them, but also be motivated, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think the book is definitely that. I think it's really informative and eye-opening and enlightening, but it also gives hope because
I think
what
it
it
does.
encourages us to do is we don't have to be the ones constantly answering questions. We can be the ones to ask them.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think for so long that's what we and I mean me myself, like I placed myself in a position where something will happen and I'll be like, right, I'm ready to answer the questions.
Mm, mm,
Fine, just bring them my way. Whatever
mm.
questions you have about what you perceive terrorism or what's going on in Palestine, whatever, like I'm here. But actually, you know what? We don't need to be in that position all the time, and we have a right to turn around and ask the questions
Yeah,
about the conditions that we're living in and why things are the way they are. And I think
yeah.
we bring that out definitely in the book really
I'm
well.
really glad to hear that. Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
even with that questioning thing, like I sometimes feel like, did our answers even change anything? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
were people asking to listen, or were they asking purely as an act of kind of domination almost? And I
Yeah.
almost feel that asking questions also helps people more, right? Because it's like, why do you think that? Like, where
Yeah.
has that come from? And
Yeah.
yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah. And sometimes I felt in certain spaces that when people ask questions, it is very intimidating. And
Yeah.
they're doing it because they feel like they want to contribute to some thing, some movement, or some
Mm,
way to defend their own ideas. And so
mm.
they're like, well, I asked the Muslim what,
Yeah, yeah,
what
no, that's a
about
good
this. And it
point.
feels, if it can feel really intimidating.
Yeah, and extracting, it's really just getting something from you that, yeah,
Yeah.
not an engagement.
One of the things I love that you wrote about in the book was about tackling all forms of racism.
Mm.
and about how until we tackle all forms of racism and we join the anti-Black movement genuinely, we're never going to tackle, we're not going to get really to tackling anywhere near Islamophobia as we need to do. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I felt it was really important to talk about this, A, because I think anti-Black racism or kind of racism that Black people experience is not just at the hands of white people. It is at the hands of South Asians, Arabs, you know, and I think particularly when it comes to conversations about Muslim experiences, we can often erase the experiences of Black Muslims, and that was one motivation, because it was like, actually, you know, especially when you put this in a global context, how we can talk about, you know, white supremacy all we want, but then if you have you know, sub-Saharan Africans being held in Libya by Muslims and not able to seek refuge, and being, you know, trafficked and being abused in all sorts of ways, then, you know, this isn't a simple case of just like Islamophobia is the only wrong, because there's something else going on here. And so I felt that was important. But also, when you start tracing Islamophobia historically, it becomes impossible to actually disentangle it from the larger kind of construction of racial hierarchy. And that's the term that I use, because I think that is what we see in the West. And I know that there's different iterations of this. Obviously, you know, for example, through Hindutva in India, we're going to have like Islamophobia in a specific manifestation today, or in other cases. But I think in the West specifically is my focus. And I think you can also still extrapolate things from this. But, you know, really what you see happen through the, you know, I won't go, I guess it's a lot of this is in the book, but like tracing 500 years of the construction of racism, what happens is there is a hierarchy that is constructed, and Islamophobia, just as a manifestation of what racism has always been, in the sense that we've spoken about. But really what I realize is that, you know, even if we try to dismantle just Islamophobia, it's not going to work, because the things that Islamophobia rests upon are the same principles of dehumanizing people, you know, saying that their lands have no value, the people have no value, that have upheld all forms of racism through colonialism always. And so, and the other thing is, you know, if you can't, it's in the same way that you can't end Islamophobia at home. It has to be global. It has to be anti-imperialist. And even if we look historically, you know, for example, in the US, the history of Muslims and the history of Black people is the same history, because it's enslaved Muslims from West Africa who are the first Muslims in America. And then you have European colonizers who take those Black Africans there, saying things like, you know, let's make sure that we don't enslave so many of Muslims, because they're radical, because they're revolutionary, because they were compelled by their faith to resist. And most of the early slave rebellions that you hear about in the Americas were led by Muslims. These are Black West African Muslims. And I think that also kind of shows that from the beginning, there's not really that separation between like religious discrimination and racial discrimination, because the way that the reason those people were imagined as dangerous, as hostile, as violent, was both because of their Blackness and their Muslimness. And I think that in specific contexts today, even, you know, who's imagined as Muslim differs in terms of kind of how, because of the colonial history of that country. So in France, actually, it is a lot more of like Arabs and Black Muslims who, rather than South Asians, whereas in Britain, because of Britain's empire, it's South Asians. And so I think we mustn't allow that. I think we just have to hold the nuance to be able to go, because of how Muslims are imagined in this context, these are the people who are primarily facing this type of state violence. That doesn't mean that racism isn't entwined with all these other racisms. And I guess just to give a concrete example, we can't simply, even if we just got rid of prevent as a piece of legislation because it's Islamophobic, that wouldn't deal with the underlying problem, which is preemptive policing, which is racial profiling through the law, which is asking teachers and, you know, doctors to, when they see somebody before them and they ascribe a race to them, to treat them differently, to criminalize them. All of that would still happen, because that's not just part of Islamophobia, it's part of all of racism. And so that's why I thought it was really important to put there, because I mean, it's just disingenuous, really. Like, there's no way we can't uproot one thing at a time. And this is the same for, you know, it's the same vice versa as well. I think this is really important that we kind of understand that it's a shared world that was built through colonialism, and we might experience it differently for sure because of how our bodies look and how we're read, but ultimately we're in it together. And so it's just a waste of time, I think, to kind of not have that broader analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with you. And so I know, and today obviously we've talked about some really heavy things, and experiences every day can be really exhausting. and your work as well, because you're working with a lot of people, you do a lot of talking, a lot of workshops. Do you have any tips on how to tackle burnout and sort of getting too upset or bogged down or, frustrated with the way that things are?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when people ask me this question because I think it's a question I also don't know the answer to, right?
Mm,
But I think for me personally, when I reflect on this question again and again, one thing I've noticed is that I think the very fact that we ask each other this question proves that we are each other's comfort. I think we get hope and we get energy and we get motivation from each other. And one thing I really felt that almost surprised me when I was writing this book was that the really heavy testimonies and stories that I heard from and read from other people, people whose homes have been raided, their children have PTSD, or they were detained for years in Guantanamo Bay, or any other kind of really facing the sharp end of violence, those really overwhelming stories instead of making me feel despair and overwhelmed and exhausted, I felt I was like, wow, they went through this, they persisted. How can I not? How can I not when I haven't faced the sharp end, when they're still here telling their story, when they haven't even got justice? And I think that the irony of that actually was what kind of made me feel able to continue to like that there is worth and there is hope and look, people do persist and they still there's something so powerful about I don't know almost these cheesy things that like these people still love their families, they're still kind, they're still making jokes. And I think that other people's persistence gives us persistence. And I think the other thing for me is just Islam. It is just, like I said earlier, I think knowing that this world isn't the be all and end all, in a way, I think when you get into that despair and that overwhelming, in a way, I guess there's a couple of things, but one is that, well, the history of our religion and our Prophet ﷺ is one of persecution and difficulty and one of like this world we never no one there was no guarantee anywhere that this world is going to be really easy and it's going to be really just and really safe. And in a way, I think that can help to kind of go, okay, like this isn't everything. And also I think remembering that it's okay to I think that one of the hadiths that somebody once kind of reframed for me was, this idea of wanting for your brother what you want for yourself. And I remember the person was like, but the premise of that is that you have to want for yourself first. You have to look after yourself to be able to give to anyone else. And I think that sometimes, and perhaps more so maybe amongst Muslims, that altruism can become also a way of neglecting ourselves. And I don't mean that in like the self-care way of like you deserve to da 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 da, but also that sometimes if you're just giving, you aren't really, in Islam we have rights on ourselves. Our body has a right on us, our family has a right on us, and so rest is something that actually you do have to do for the sake of your well-being. It's not kind of a virtue to grind yourself into the ground. And again, I'm saying all of this, but these are things I think about. These are not necessarily things I'm good at myself, but I think that it's like balance, isn't it, with anything, and with Islam maybe in particular, and going out into nature and being like, what, the world is still beautiful, it's still miraculous, and not kind of becoming desensitized to, oh my God, a mountain, like what is a mountain? That's insane. Trees, what flower? Like I think you have to kind of retain that playful kind of curiosity about the world to still see that God, there is so much beauty despite all the despair. And we know that with hardship there is ease, there is both, there's complexity, there's contradiction, and that's just part of it. And I think for me, having a creative outlet, writing, journaling, like that is if I didn't journal every day, I would honestly, I think I'd be so overwhelmed. And I'm like such an evangelical. When any of my friends are like in a low place, I'm like, just please, just write, just please write. And I think, but people will have different outlets, won't they? And I think, there's nothing wrong with expressing everything that you feel, and sometimes that's the best that can be it. But yeah, I am open to kind of learning. And I think the final point on that is that we are interdependent beings. We're not independent. And I think a lot of self-care kind of narratives currently are very individualistic. It's that, you'll feel better if you have a bath, if you buy this thing. But actually I think we are, yeah, we need each other. We need people, and can't you can't be well completely on your own. And I think that's a really difficult thing to sit with. But I think we do need others, and perhaps difficulty is that, how do we all collectively get better and heal from all these because these are communal traumas that we've spoken about. These aren't just individual traumas. But then again, that's maybe why speaking to others does in of itself, like even though, like you say, this has been heavy conversation. I feel nourished just knowing that, you feel the same. You've thought about these things. You're out there doing your thing. Like, we're all here, we're all trying. And I think that in of itself is really like reassuring. And I think sometimes reassurance is all you need.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's really nice. And actually, so because I work in the charity sector, I'm sometimes bombarded with like really sad stories, or like, I read a lot of reports that have some really horrific figures in it or things. And I think one of the things I find comfort in is when I have met people and they're sharing their story, and I feel so, in every moment, that in every situation that I've been in, I always feel so honored to be on the receiving end of their story, and to know that I have the ability to take it forward, even if it's just to one person, or even if it's just to myself and to my family, right? Like, I have the ability to spread their story or to share their story. But I do find myself marveling whenever especially if I've been in someone's home and I just see them, like if I like see children laughing, or like someone's cracked a joke or something, and I just feel like even in the depths of despair, there is still joy, and there's the human nature, I think, the inclination that we have towards laughter and to just finding happiness in small things. And I think we can take a lot from that in a very, not a condescending way at all. I think we can take a lot from that. And it's not that, therefore we don't need to help these people because they're still happy even though they're going through awful things. That's not what it is at all. But I think we can take a lot in understanding that balance, and that no matter how dark things can feel or things are, that there are glimmers of hope. I really believe that. And it's not that I don't necessarily see it or feel it in every moment.
No, I'm with you.
I like, it's something that I try to hold on to for sure.
Yeah. And sometimes that can be the most powerful form of resistance, where it's like, actually they want to, depending what type of violence we're talking about, but in a world that kind of, where everything is geared to crushing you, really, to crushing the life out of you, laughing can actually be quite like wow, you dare still to laugh under these conditions. You dare to find joy, you dare to kind of love one another. And I think I agree with you. That's not to take away from material conditions at all, but to kind of see that actually the spirit of being human and like kind of being persistent is something really moving.
Yeah, definitely. And I would love to keep talking, but I'm just going to ask you one final question because we are running out of time. What are your biggest sources of inspiration in terms of literature, but also just in your life in general? Where do you find the greatest inspiration?
I think alhamdulillah, I'm really close to my mum's parents, so my grandparents, and I think that honestly it is one of those things where, especially writing this particular book in lockdown, isolation, like there's just like, so it could at times be very lonely, very isolating. I think honestly, like even the stuff we spoke about earlier on about intergenerational kind of like experiences of racism and kind of analyses, I think really there's something, it's almost hard to describe about why that's inspiring, but I think just there is something about elders and seeing the ways that they've persisted and the ways that they remain joyful, and the ways that created so much capacity for us to do things that I find really like grounding, I suppose, and that somehow is also inspiring. And I think also a lot of inspiration, like I say, through the people that I interviewed or the testimonies that I've read, because it's just like, God, people still are seeking accountability and justice after just never having got it and having gone through things that I could never go through. I think they would break me, those things. And so I think it's more the everyday kind of heroes that do inspire you. And like they say, the real influences in your life are not the people that you see on social media, but they're the people that are the closest to you, because they have the biggest influence on you. And I think that's true. And I think, at the same time as writing this book, I remember feeling like there's some sort of cognitive dissonance, because really in my personal life, there was like a lot of family health crises going on and all sorts of things, which I'm sure lots of people experienced in the last few years. But actually, at one moment, I realized, these things are not entirely separate at all. Like, this is the world in which these things happen, and they're not disconnected. And so, actually, that was a motive as well, because it was like, we deserve, kind of what I was saying earlier, we deserve an analysis, we deserve more, we deserve Islam on our own terms, we deserve to kind of have more healing and health and wellness and safety. And so I think that, and I think working with kids, I always just find working with kids so inspiring because it's just a reminder that like it's motivation, isn't it? It's like, you know what? I want you to have a vaster imagination than I had. I want you to, live much more kind of just like I want you to have these realizations earlier than I did. I don't want you to wait until you're, in your 20s and be like, oh my God, maybe I'm just performing. It's like so different things. And obviously so many different books and authors and talks and, all sorts of kind of influences. And I think even those ones that years later you're like, you don't realize how you might remember a line that somebody said to you. I think that list is endless, really.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time today. It has been such a pleasure talking to you.
It's been really lovely to talk to you too. I really appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah, hopefully we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
All right, jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much to Suhaiymah for her time and words of wisdom and inspiration. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media.